BBC One. Now we join David Dimbleby live at Westminster for the state opening of Parliament.
This is Central Lobby at the heart of the Houses of Parliament, halfway between the House of Lords there, the Commons over there. And when Parliament's meeting, this is where you come to berate your MP. But not today. Today it's state opening and the whole palace is given over to pageantry. And watching for the first time, the most unexpected new MP, Dr. Richard Taylor, who won Kidderminster as independent, campaigning to save his local hospital. How do you feel this morning, waiting for this to start?
Oh, absolutely thrilled to be here, voted in as an independent, a true representative of the people.
Good. Well, stay with us and enjoy the pageantry and the fun. So good morning and welcome to committee room number 3 in the Palace of Westminster. A grand setting, very expensive wallpaper. Could have been chosen by the Lord Chancellor himself, probably was. And here we are for this programme for the state opening. One of those rooms where much of the serious work of Parliament goes on, not so much in the House of Commons, but here where they scrutinise legislation. This is actually where the Lords work. With us we've got some people who've been, one of them been in the House of Commons over 50 years. Tony Benn, who's joined us. Nicholas Soames, the Conservative MP for Mid-Sussex. And here to talk about the state opening and about politics. And in the House of Lords, for her first state opening, Lady Boothroyd, who, as Betty Boothroyd, was, of course, a famous Speaker of the House of Commons. She'll be joining us, too, after the speech. And with us a man who developed unexpected skills during his 6 years as Black Rod, from which he just retired.
Sir Edward has distinguished himself more recently as a celebrity on television, and I myself, as an occasional appearer on television, deeply am envious of his wonderful clothing. I discovered only yesterday, in an unguarded moment from Sir Edward himself, that he is now capable of turning into or changing into his full resplendency in just over 5 minutes, an attribute that I only wish I could emulate myself.
Sir Edward Jones, who until a few weeks ago was the man who banged on the door of the House of Commons on behalf of the Queen, is here with us. And Zainab Badawi is going to be talking to some of the lively new MPs about what they make of their first few days here.
I'm here outside the Palace of Westminster, where people have been lining up to catch sight of the Queen. I'll be heading inside to talk to, amongst other people, the man who at the last state opening of Parliament was held hostage in Buckingham Palace to ensure the Queen's safety.
And I was talking very briefly a moment ago to Dr. Richard Taylor, the independent elected because of anger over the NHS closing Kidderminster Hospital. And the government, you remember, made great play in the campaign during the election about improvements to the NHS. And Sian Williams is going to be down there at Kidderminster today to see how people react to any announcements that we have. So we'll be talking to her. And if you have any comments, either on the ceremony of state opening, or on the laws that are proposed in the Queen's speech, or indeed comments to make on anything said during this programme, please be unfashionable for once and email us here. I gather people have given up on the email, but anyway, there's our email address if you want to use it, and it's also in Radio Times. Now, the proceedings here start with colourful pageantry, and it's followed by the speech from the throne, which is written by the government, just spoken by the Queen, which spells out Labour's plans for using their big majority. And already in the members' lobby of the House of Commons, MPs gathering at the start of the new Parliament, they all have to come here and they're not allowed to take part in the proceedings until they've sworn their oath of allegiance, even if they are former members being returned. So they've been swearing in.
Do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that I'll be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors, according to law.
I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors, according to law. So help me God.
Leader of the Conservative Party. And if they haven't sworn in by the time that Black Rod hammers on the door, they're not allowed to sit in the chamber. Down in the House of Lords, a sea of red and ermine as the peers, the old and the new, gather for this ceremony. Up in the gallery watching, there's Pauline Prescott, John Prescott's wife, and I think to be joined a bit later on. Oh, and Leo Beckett, Margaret Beckett's husband, and her consort during her political life. she's been promoted in the reshuffle that followed the election. Archbishop of Canterbury there, the bishops come in, the Bishop of London next to him, and they have the right to sit in the House of Lords, a number of them. The judges with their backs to us, sentence of judges, Court of Appeal and others. But the ceremonial actually began a few moments ago when the imperial state crown was brought here. It used to come by boat from Hampton Court downriver, so it's carried by a barge master, Robert Crouch, who will pass it over to Malcolm Ross. Malcolm Ross, who's controller of the Lord Chamberlain's office. And makes very rare appearances, this crown, just at the state opening and at the coronation. But of course it's what every child in the country expects the Queen to wear when she comes on a visit to their school. They're always disappointed the Queen doesn't have a crown on her head, and when you see the crown in a moment you'll see why. It's the most dazzling of crowns, constantly being remade or refashioned. But it's got very nearly 3,000 diamonds in it, and sapphires and rubies and goodness knows what. Behind the cap of maintenance on the right and the sword of state. We'll talk about them in just a moment. And the crown was brought up here to the Royal Gallery, where people have been sitting waiting. They don't get much of a look in on this ceremony, but they're guests of people in the palace, and they sit here and they simply see the Queen's procession go up and then back, and that's it. And the cap of maintenance and the sword of state are there. Cap of maintenance was originally given, history says, to Henry VIII by the Pope for his loyalty to the Church of Rome before his divorce. The Lord Chancellor, this is a very powerful man in this government, the Lord Chancellor's procession, Lord Irvine of Lairg, who's taken on a number of new powers since the election. He was the Prime Minister's boss in the when he was in Chambers as a barrister, but he was actually appointed by Neil Kinnock as Shadow Lord Chancellor. So the Prime Minister always says it wasn't an act of cronyism that he has Lord Irvine as Lord High Chancellor. And his job today is to greet the Queen when she arrives and then to give her the speech, which she'll be reading, which she actually had sent to her yesterday and has been signed. He's just checking it's there. And with him, Robin Cook, leader of the House of Commons, President of the Council, in a morning suit, doesn't have a uniform for that job. And the Lord Chancellor is now apparently taking over responsibility for freedom of information from the Home Office and for human rights and for data protection and various other constitutional matters, which seems to have passed rather unnoticed among all the changes that have been made, that so much power is concentrated in the hands of an unelected political figure. The heralds on either side in their tabards. And this all began, of course, with the general election, in which just over half of us chose to vote, which began with the Prime Minister asking the Queen for a dissolution of Parliament. And this is the document that the Queen signs. She actually signed it on the 11th of May in front of members of the Privy Council. And it used to be read by those heralds right round the country. Nowadays it's just the town clerk in London and Lord Lyon, King of Arms in Edinburgh, who reads it. Outside the House of Commons, MPs gathering. The Churchill Arch, the distinctive figure of Winston Churchill, hands on his hips on the left there. And this arch is the last remaining part of the old House of Commons that was badly destroyed in bombing in the war. There were particularly bad raids in May 1941 when the whole chamber was virtually wiped out. And after that, for the rest of the war, it wasn't possible for the Commons to meet here. They moved across the road, first of all, and met in Church House. Oddly, we have pictures of it, but with actors playing the part because it wasn't permissible to film the House of Commons in the 40s. And it wasn't until 1951 the Commons was rebuilt. In the meantime, the Commons sat in the House of Lords. The Lords sat in the robing room where the Queen puts on her crown, her throne, and her robe to go to the throne. And Churchill said that the arch should be left as it was to remind people of what had happened, and this is the arch damaged in the Blitz. Well, a lot of MPs waiting there, some of them new boys. David Trimble, I think, very much an old boy at the left there, leader of the Ulster Unionists. And these MPs all got here by the process of election in 659 constituencies. 659 separate writs, a terrific fuss made with these. They're all sent out in separate mail bags to the returning officer, and he's ordered then to send it back on the Sunday following the election. If he gets anything wrong, they don't ring him up and say what's wrong. He has to come down to Westminster to put it right. And 2 hapless returning officers had to come down to Westminster. I don't know what for, maybe not signing them. I doubt it was for getting the wrong name of the elected MP, but thus all duly elected and milling around there in the members' lobby outside the House of Commons. And it being 11:10, the Queen is now on her way down Whitehall with her long procession, first and second divisions of the Sovereign's escort of the Household Cavalry, and she's in the Irish state coach. And the number of horses they're using here this year, because of Royal Ascot, has meant that they've had to take horses away from Ascot, and they aren't going to have processions in the state landaus on 2 of the days they normally do, not because the Sovereign's escort isn't there, but the horses that are pulling the coach with the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. Meantime, in the House of Lords, patiently waiting, everybody except the House of Commons, all the people who are not elected, because as yet we don't have any elected peers, though we do now have, though they're not here today, these people's peers, they were called, chosen peers, but actually most of them seem to be the kind of people who got here anyway by appointment. But there are proposals afoot in the manifesto that some of these people would be elected. There are 3 Labour peers, Baroness Simons in the middle, Baroness Scotland on the left, Lord Ali on the right, and the Earl of Onslow, one of the survivors and one of the eccentrics in the House of Lords. And another couple talking together, you'll recognise somebody who tried to help the Tories win the election on the left, of course Baroness Thatcher, and Lord Wetherell, former Speaker of the House of Commons. But here is the judges, the ambassadors, the wives of some of the peers, guests of all kinds, and they're all facing the throne, which is where the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh come. Now, the House of Commons stand way at the back end of our picture here, looking out over there. They're not given seats. They stand and listen to the speech. National anthem playing as the Irish state coach approaches Westminster. Brief shot there of Princess Anne, who, as Goldstick-in-Waiting, takes part in this procession. The 4 greys come in under the Victoria Tower, with Colin Henderson driving them. Not an easy entrance there. You have to turn sharp left, and as it happens, the Union flag is lowered, and this enormous royal standard, 26 feet by 12, I think it is, vast flag, is hoisted to the top of the Victoria Tower to show that the Queen has come to what is formerly her palace. Duke of Edinburgh, in his uniform of Admiral of the Fleet, gets out and helps the Queen down. And the Queen has all the women who take part in this ceremony today in evening dress. She wears a diadem at this stage and is led with state trumpeters playing a salute into the palace. The procession of heralds, the familiar figures, they change, but their uniforms haven't changed for centuries, who are in reality genealogists who plot your family's history, if you want it, and design coats of arms. And they're followed by the Lord Chancellor there, Robin Cook, beside him. Now the Queen, followed by her ladies-in-waiting and ladies of the bedchamber, as they're archaically called, they're actually people who work on her staff, go with her into the robing room where she will put on the crown and the Parliament robe. And here in the Royal Gallery, the heralds, some of whom go through to the House of Lords, and three of whom stay behind to lead the Sovereign's procession. These are lawyers and architectural historians. One of them is the Earl Marshal's secretary. One of them administers the royal collections. And they're all identified with the part of the country they're supposed to concentrate on. Lancaster Herald, York Herald, Richmond Herald, Chester Herald, names like that. And they're about to come through the Prince's chamber and into the House of Lords, where they stand around the throne. And there are two people here in the House of Lords today who are there as guests of the House of Lords, but also our guests who are going to be watching. Paul Thompson and Julie Greenwood, one a non-voter, one a voter, both of here for the first time to see these events, and they're sitting up there in the gallery, and we'll be talking to them about their reaction to this as people who are dubious about whether the political system is working to their benefit. So there they are, sitting watching this for the first time, and we'll be hearing from them later on. They've been shown around by Lady Boothroyd here, and she took them on a tour of the house.
Can I give you one of our leaflets?
I'm going to give it a miss. I'm not going to vote at all. Why should I vote for a party that doesn't do anything for me?
I've always voted. I think it's important to vote, and I think it's only the bone idle who don't go out and vote.
It's a shame they don't carry it on.
It was Betty Boothroyd who took them round Parliament for the first time.
In all your years of working here in the House of Commons, how did you manage to keep all the MPs in check?
With difficulty sometimes, Paul. But I don't want a silent house. I don't want a morgue in the chamber of the Commons. I like the robust, the cut and thrust of debate, of intervention. Now, isn't this it's a very ornate chamber? Isn't it beautiful?
How different is this chamber to the Commons?
I think it's quite important for our system to have two chambers.
If you had a choice, which system would you have? Would you have the hereditary, or would you have the way it is now?
Well, I like the mixture. I'm not sure that personally I would want to go to a fully elected chamber. I like the mixture, and of course I don't know where the Prime Minister is going. with further reform. You have to ask him about that. This is where I hand you over now, because here is the red of the House of Lords, the upholstery and the carpets that you've just seen, into the central lobby, where all the furnishings are of green. They're all Commons green. And here is this wonderful, great central lobby with, you see the mosaics, the mosaic ceiling. And now Sir Alan Hazelhurst is going to take over and take you into the Commons.
Here we are in the Commons chamber. This is always the government side of the House. That is the opposition side. So we have this adversarial system.
Pressure groups were obviously important. Are they reflected here, or is it all behind the scenes?
A lot of the things we do on behalf of our constituents are actually hidden from view. People say to me, well, you know, unless you speak in the House of Commons or ask a question, how are you representing us? The answer is through hundreds of letters that you're writing on their behalf to ministers and to other outside bodies. And also, it's the arm round the shoulder here in the lobbies when you say, oh, by the way, can I have a word with you about such and such? I've got a problem
Perhaps
in his
that
constituency.
side of it should be publicised a little bit more, because then people can actually see that government is working for them, and they won't be turning around and going, well, they just sat down there talking about bugger all, so why should I go out and vote, because they're doing nothing for me anyway.
From what you've seen today, is there anything which has persuaded you to think that the system is better than you originally thought?
There is parts of it that I do like, but I still think there's a lot of change needed before I would actually go out and vote again. I think, like on the ballot paper, there should actually be another tick box saying none of the above, not interested. It might actually get people to actually do something.
Tony Benn, do you think people are losing interest in the House of Commons?
Well, I've seen this ceremony 50 times, and it is a celebration of an undemocratic system of government. I mean, when you look at them there, we don't elect our head of state, we don't elect the House of Lords, the Prime Minister appoints the bishops and the judges, and to sit in the House of Commons, if you're a Democrat, as I am, you have to tell a lie. I'm a Democrat. Why should I have to tell a lie to sit in the House of Commons?
We'll talk about that a bit later on.
No, but I mean, that's what I feel about it, and I think anyone watching this might very well feel this has nothing to do with solving my housing problem or a job for me. And that's been my feeling from the beginning.
Nicholas Soames, do you think it's out of touch, the House of Commons? I mean, not for the ceremonial reason necessarily, but because of the work it does.
I don't think it is at all, but I do think, I really don't. In fact, I think Parliament does its job a very great deal better than it is given credit for. But I do think that if you go on hacking away at the roots of a great tree, you will do it terrible damage. And so much criticism and opprobrium, some of it legitimate, is heaped upon Parliament, that it has fallen in the esteem of the nation to a level which I think is dangerous.
You're talking about the House of Commons?
I'm talking about Parliament as a whole, yes, the House of Commons in particular.
Do you think the House of Commons has fallen into low esteem?
Well, I think what Alan Hazelhurst said is right. 95% of my work as a member, and I'm sure it's true, Nicholas, is looking after constituency problems. People come, 1,000 people used to come a year to see me personally, and you try and help them, and then you think what could be done. But the House of Commons has abandoned its role of holding the government to account. That is a legitimate criticism. And I think now, with a big majority and the Prime Minister's idea of a presidential system, we have a president, but we don't have a House of Representatives. And that situation has got to change. And I think that's one reason why people have a low regard.
But Parliament hasn't abandoned it. It has been, the holding of account has been in many ways taken away from Parliament. It hasn't consciously abandoned it, and it is up to Parliament to seize it back again.
Oh,
Sir
Edward, as a former Black Rod and in charge of this until 6 weeks ago, do you think the ceremonial is part of the problem?
Yes, I do. I believe that this is the one occasion in the year when the three elements in our Constitution, the sovereign, the peers and the Commons, meet together once, symbolically, I accept, to demonstrate to the people at large what it is that forms the focal point of our Constitution.
And you think that's a good thing?
And I think that's a good thing. And I think it should be done properly. I personally, as you might expect, appreciate the dressing up and the ceremonial and all those other aspects of the occasion, because I think that this encourages people outside to take account of what is going on.
Okay, well, let's see a bit more of what is going on, because we're waiting now for the Speaker's procession, and the Speaker who is elected and will be coming through Central Lobby in a moment. The Speaker, Michael Martin, who was chosen in October last year, took over from Betty Boothroyd. He's the MP for Glasgow Springburn, a Labour MP, but when he becomes Speaker, he gives up the party allegiance. And this is his first state opening. He says he thinks it of great symbolic constitutional importance. House of Commons there waiting for him. They sit here and wait until they're summoned to the House of Lords. In order to show their defiance of the role of the Queen in all this, and the monarch rather, they in fact don't immediately today start debating the measures that are put before and by her, that's to say by the Prime Minister, but choose another measure, a trivial one, which is always just as a formality put first. The Speaker we don't often see as grandly dressed as that, because he dresses rather down in the House of Commons, not liking the breeches and the silk stockings. He gave all that up. But every day he does this walk, which Betty Boothroyd did. And this is where we saw her a moment ago. Led by the Sergeant-at-Arms, who's an important figure in the House of Commons. He has a staff of 400 people, and he is as important in the House of Commons as Black Rod in the Lords. The chaplain to the Speaker at the back of the procession. Liberal Democrats and Ulster Unionists on the left of your picture there, Labour on the right, the government benches further up. No sign of Dennis Skinner in his usual place. Now the front bench there, John Prescott, you can see David Blunkett, Margaret Beckett. And Black Rod has taken up his position, the new Black Rod, General Sir Michael Wilcox. The division bell ringing there to say that the House of Commons is going into session. Now, the Lords, of course, have nothing to do at all except gossip to each other at this stage. They're waiting for the arrival of the Queen, and gossip away they do. And in the Royal Gallery, we're waiting for the Queen, the Marquess of Cholmondeley there, the Lord Great Chamberlain comes out with a white wand, and he will walk backwards in front of the Queen into the House of Lords. So he goes and faces the doors, two state trumpeters you can just see who play a royal salute as the Queen comes out. Now, this is the silent part of the procession. As they go through the Royal Gallery with the Lord Great Chamberlain and the Deputy Earl Marshal, the son of the Earl Marshal, the Earl of Arundel on the right there, walking backwards. And then Lord Williams of Mostyn, who's the new leader of the Labour Party, or the new leader of the House of Lords, with the cap of maintenance. And on his left, the Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Lord Craig of Radley, with the Sword of State. And the Queen will be reading a speech that she saw yesterday and signed, and which is sometimes accused of being too political. But I noticed reading the speech that George VI gave, that he said something which would be thought very political nowadays, which was, "I rejoice," was the word he used, "to know the outlook for trade and industry remains favourable." We don't get those kind of words exactly from the monarch these days, but nevertheless there were accusations that the first Labour government were putting too many words into her mouth which sounded politically correct. Well, there's no reason why they shouldn't, because it's their speech and everybody knows that, not the Queen's speech. And it will give us the first indication of what they intend to do with this new majority they have.
My lords, pray be seated.
Lord Great Chamberlain gives a signal to Black Rod, who's in the central lobby, and he sets off for the House of Commons. And this little bit of the procedure is probably the best known part of the state opening, which is the door being slammed in the face of Black Rod as a sign that the House of Commons is sovereign, sees itself as sovereign, is not prepared to let him come on the sovereign's business until it's finished doing what it has to do. But it's largely a formality, though there have been occasions in recent years. Labour MPs at one point refused to allow Black Rod in until Michael Heseltine had withdrawn a bill. So it is still used, but today purely a pantomime reproduction of that event.
Mr. Speaker, the Queen commands this honourable House to attend Her Majesty immediately in the House of Peers.
Well, he did that all right. He was nervous about doing it. He said he was worried he might forget his lines, because the previous Black Rod did it impeccably. And there was no shout from Dennis Skinner. Usually he has something to say. He drinks Black Label or some remark like that, but I didn't hear him say anything today. Anyway, that is the House of Commons on their way out, down to the Lords now. Prime Minister at the front, with the leader of the Conservative Party, William Hague. And then some of the new ministers, and here, backbench, another Charles Clarke there, just see it, a powerful figure in the new government with the bald head, Alistair Darling on the left. Difficult to spot them all as they crowd out. And in central lobby, led by the Speaker, they're on their way down to the House of Lords. It is curious, this ceremony, because in a way the Commons are treated with discourtesy by everybody in the palace. That's to say, they're kept till the end, and then they shuffle in and they're not allowed to sit down. On the other hand, they use the opportunity to exert their own ego and position by shuffling in and chatting away and not treating it as a great ceremonial event for their part, which indeed for their part it isn't. They're about to hear the legislation and then they're sent back to the House of Commons to get on with it. interesting moment for the new Parliament, of course. All the attention is much less on a government that's been elected with a huge majority than in the goings-on in the Conservative Party, trying to find a new leader. You may have caught a glimpse of Anne Widdecombe, who withdrew from the competition there. Kenneth Clarke, one of the people who we're told will be running, is either bird watching or on business in Vietnam, depending which version you believe. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jack Straw, the new Foreign Secretary, Margaret Beckett in charge of the environment, powerful new, one of many, there are 4 new women in the cabinet, I think, but she was in the cabinet before. And we wait while they come in there, and other MPs go upstairs. And not until they're all in place is a signal given to the Lord Chancellor that he can take the speech up to the Queen. So there's the Lord Chancellor.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's central objectives are economic stability and investment and reform in public services, leading to a more prosperous and inclusive society. To this end, my government will continue to secure low inflation and sound public finances. My government's main priorities for the forthcoming session will be reform in education, health, crime, and welfare. My government will introduce legislation to reform education. An education bill will be introduced to promote diversity and higher standards, particularly in secondary schools. It will provide new opportunities for school sponsorship, more options for tackling failing schools, and greater freedom for successful head teachers and governors. My government will introduce legislation to reform health services. A bill will decentralize power and direct resources to National Health Service staff, give patients greater influence on the running of the National Health Service, and strengthen regulation of the health professions. Legislation will be drafted to reform the provision of health services in Wales. Legislation will be brought forward to reform sentencing and rules of evidence, with measures to tackle corruption and sex offenders. A bill will be introduced to increase powers against money laundering, establish a criminal assets recovery agency, and make it easier to recover the proceeds of crime and drugs. Legislation will be brought forward to help the police fight crime, ensure that they can cooperate effectively across police force boundaries, and establish a new complaint system. Legislation to reform the criminal court system will be drafted in the light of the forthcoming recommendations from the review by Lord Justice Auld. Legislation will be introduced to extend the life of the Football Disorder Act. My government will introduce legislation to reform the welfare system. A bill will include measures to help more people back into work. Legislation will also be brought forward to introduce the new tax credit system and to establish the new pension credit for pensioners. My government will introduce legislation to encourage enterprise, strengthen competition laws, and promote safeguards for consumers. A draft bill to create a single regulator for the media and communications industries and reform the broadcasting and telecommunications regulations will be published. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public service will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, in Northern Ireland, my government will continue to work closely with the political parties and the Irish government to secure the full implementation of the Belfast Agreement. My government maintains its commitment to devolution in Scotland and Wales. Following consultation, my government will introduce legislation to implement the second phase of House of Lords reform. My government will prepare legislation to allow political parties to make positive moves to increase the representation of women in public life. My government will publish draft legislation to take forward the recommendations of Lord Cullen's inquiry into rail safety. Legislation will be introduced to reform the system of land registration to promote greater electronic conveyancing. The bill to reform the purchase of freeholds by leaseholders and to create common hold, a new form of tenure for flat owners, will be reintroduced. My government will introduce legislation to make the age entitlement for concessionary travel fares the same for men and women at the age of 60. A bill will be introduced to reform adoption law to make children's interests paramount and tackle inter-country adoption. My government will enable a free vote to take place on the future of hunting with dogs. Other measures will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, the Duke of Edinburgh and I were delighted to pay a state visit to Norway at the end of May. Similarly, we were pleased to receive the state visit of His Excellency the President of South Africa and Mrs. Mbeki last week. The Duke of Edinburgh and I look forward to attending the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Australia and subsequently visiting New Zealand in October. We also look forward to receiving a state visit by the King and Queen of Jordan this autumn. My government will work with our partners to make sure that Europe has the most competitive knowledge-based economy in the world. It will work for rapid progress on the enlargement of the European Union and will introduce legislation to enable the United Kingdom to ratify the Treaty of Nice and implement the Berlin Own Resources decision on the Union's future funding. NATO will remain the cornerstone of Britain's national security, and my government will work for a still more effective alliance defence. In this context, and to enable the European Union to act where NATO chooses not to do so, my government will work to improve the European Union's capacity and member states' capabilities for humanitarian, peacekeeping and crisis management tasks. Legislation will be introduced to improve the transparency of export controls and to establish their purpose. Tackling climate change and making a reality of sustainable development will be a priority for my government. It will fulfill the United Kingdom's international obligations arising from the Kyoto Protocol. My government will work for an early and comprehensive world trade round, which will benefit industrialized and developing countries alike. In the United Nations, my government will support a more modern and representative Security Council and work to make conflict prevention and peacekeeping more effective. My government will work to encourage universal observance of human rights, including throughout the Commonwealth. My government will continue to work for a more effective global effort to reduce poverty and will reintroduce its bill to entrench and strengthen the poverty focus to development work. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
So the Lord Chancellor recovers the speech, and the pages go forward to help the Queen with her Parliament robe. House of Lords rises, and in that very brief ceremony we've heard the plans for Labour for the next 18 months, which we'll be talking about a bit later on. But let's just watch what's going on in the House of Lords. The gentlemen at arms, you don't see them in this ceremony, you can just see their plumes of their helmets there, the nearest guard to the sovereign. And they stay in the Prince's chamber. They were suspended, they were founded in 1509, I think it was, by Henry VIII. They were suspended during the Commonwealth under Cromwell, reinstituted by Charles II. And our two guests have been up there watching in the gallery, and we'll be hearing their reaction to the ceremony later on when they come and join us here. Two of the younger people there today. The MPs on their way back to the House of Commons, the same procession in reverse, and they go to debate the Queen's speech this afternoon and for the next few days. The Prime Minister and William Hague. Francis Maude on the left, Shadow Foreign Secretary, a supporter of Michael Portillo for the Conservative Party, talking to John Prescott. And Duke of Edinburgh, in the meantime, with a speech that talks about the further reform of the House of Lords, talks about a new vote on hunting, talks about measures to tackle sex offences. David Blunkett at the Home Office to be proposed a solution there, and references to the NHS and education, which after the election would to be expected. The gentlemen at arms follow her down here. The yeomen of the bodyguard on left and right. The Queen goes into the robing room to disrobe, have her photograph taken for her Jubilee picture. Next year, she celebrates her 50th anniversary of being on the crown. And they're all brilliantly lit there, but here in our studio, in committee room number 3, we've been plunged into darkness, so I think we'll have to talk without being able to see the faces, if you can. Anyway, the faces you can see there are far more decorative, I'm sure, than ours. Andrew Marr, first of all, BBC's political editor. What do you make of that speech? Were there any surprises in it?
Non-decorative face. David, no, not really.
I didn't say non-decorative face.
You implied it. No. Almost everything that was said here has been said ad nauseam in different language during the general election campaign over the last 4 to 6 weeks, and it would be almost unconstitutional if there was a major surprise at this stage. This is, by and large, what Labour put before the country. A couple of interesting things, though. We're sitting here surrounded by newspapers this morning about John Thaw fighting throat cancer. And on this morning of all mornings, we find that the much-touted bill to ban tobacco advertising is one of the things that has been dropped from this Queen's speech. I imagine there will be some kind of controversy about that later on.
Okay. Well, let's just talk about how the ceremony went. We have got daylight here. It's rather nice daylight. It's cooler. Sir Edward Jones, you were Black Rod until 6 weeks ago. How did your successor do you think?
I think he did very well indeed. He's had a very busy week. He's had to cope with the Garter ceremony on Monday, rehearsals for that on Friday. He's brand new in the job. He's had to deal with the preparations, the rehearsals, and now today, nobody could have been dropped in from a greater height into a deeper pond.
He didn't have Dennis Skinner to insult him like you did when you did it for the first time. He said, I didn't catch an insult, but he was probably very nervous that Dennis Skinner would have something.
I was given due warning that Dennis Skinner would try and interrupt the flow. My only disappointment was that on two further occasions he made the same remark as he'd made on the first one.
Now, Margaret Jay, you were leader of the Lords and carrying the cap of maintenance last time round. Baroness Jay, I should call you. Did you like carrying the cap of maintenance? Did you feel it all fitted in with the way we do things here?
Well, I have to say that carrying the cap of maintenance was not my favourite job as leader of the Lords. In fact, I do remember asking one of the very senior courtiers if I could perhaps not carry it on a stick, which, as you will have seen, is part of the protocol, but carry it on a cushion, which I thought I might be more comfortable with. He said he thought it would look like a dead squirrel, and I was bound to say that I thought exactly was the answer. But at a serious level, I do think that there is enormous value in some of the ceremonial of the Queen in Parliament, the points you were making about the relative stature of the houses.
You disagree with Tony Benn on this?
Well, I
think it's all illegitimate?
Well, I think the point that's illegitimate, in a sense, is to ask active politicians to be directly involved, to have walk-on roles, as it were, in this ceremonial, because I think that is not necessarily particularly fitting. The concept of the crown in Parliament is one thing. The concept of my dear friend Dennis Carter, the Chief Whip in the House of Lords, being translated into being the captain of the Gentlemen of Arms and having to wear spurs and all of these kind of things, I don't think necessarily adds to the dignity of Parliament. And at a serious level, if we are concerned, as I'm sure we all are, about trying to involve younger people and people who didn't vote, for example, in the general election, in what politics is about, what the Houses of Parliament are about in the 21st century, I'm not sure that this kind of ceremonial will engage them.
We've had some very... I asked for emails. I was surprised we did get some. We often ask for emails and nothing comes in, but we've asked for emails and we got some rather good ones. One of them says, given the low turnout in the general election, isn't it time we modernise Parliament at the state opening? Do you know how many people wear a gown or wig down to the boozer on a Friday? MPs and all connected with today's event should be kitted out with hooded tops, tracksuit bottoms and baseball caps. It's rather what William Hague did when he took over the leadership of the Conservative Party. Another one, though, I think the traditions and ceremonies of the state opening are superb. They represent our history and heritage and not least of all seem to be the only thing distinguishing us from the Americans. Another saying, I find it fascinating insight into the heritage and tradition of our country, grace to the political system. On the other hand, isn't it about time we dumped this silly fancy dress nonsense? It has no value at all. And this sort of ceremonial nonsense is one of the main reasons younger people in our country feel removed from the political process. So opinion is very much divided, isn't it? On this?
Well, we're the last colony in the British Empire, and this is a colonial event.
We being who? Sorry,
I'm talking about Britain as the last colony in the British Empire.
Yes.
And the only person I ever took to the opening of Parliament who understood it was an African. He said, I see, there's the chief on her stool, there are the wise men of the tribe, the judges with long wigs, there are the witch doctors, the bishops, there are the landowners with animal skins, and there are the public trying to get justice. And he
Sorry, who was the public? The
public were the members of Parliament, of course, up in the gallery.
They're the ones with the power.
Pardon?
They're the ones with the power.
Well, you could ask that with the World Trade Organization in Brussels and all that, but that's another matter.
Well, they wouldn't all come to the state opening.
No, but the truth is...
the World Trade Organization.
Look, David, the Queen's speech was available in this studio before it was read. Now, I know I shouldn't say that because I'm whistleblowing on the BBC, but the government wrote it, the Queen got it, Andrew Marr got it, and MPs heard it later. Now, if that doesn't tell you a shift in the balance of power, but maybe you should dress up and appear in the opening of Parliament in your proper role.
It hardly...
No, I mean, I have to say that...
No, I don't mind you saying it at all, but it hardly sounds a very serious thing. Nothing much the BBC can do with the Queen's speech in advance, except get a good picture of the Chancellor's.
No, the point is it's a reminder of the power of the media vis-à-vis the power of Parliament. I mean, that is what it's about, because as a member of Parliament, I wouldn't have heard it. I'm not blaming you. I mean, if I'd been in the BBC, I'd have tried to
You were in the BBC,
well, I
of course,
was,
so
yes,
you did subscribe to all these values in the past.
Well, I don't say that.
I was just going to make the point that one of the interesting things that's going to happen in the next session of Parliament is something called Parliament First, which is, I think, the first time that I can recall MPs, backbenchers, quite senior people getting together across party to say we must restore some of the powers of the elected Commons chamber vis-à-vis the executive and the government. So these are live issues. These are not dead issues.
Nicholas Soames, what do you make of the emails I read out and this apparent clear description?
They're exactly as I would expect them to be. But I do, with respect, disagree with Margaret Jay. I think it's the point that Sir Edward Jones made about the symbolism of the coming together of the three estates within Parliament at this particular time. It's very important that elected politicians take place within that structure, and that Lord Carter is seen to be part of that, because he very much is. This, after all, is the dignified side of our Constitution. And this afternoon, at 2:30, the gloves come off, and we go back to the ordinary rough and tumble of parliamentary life. Now, as to the question of this piffle about, you know, people don't vote because of what they see at the state opening, that is just nonsense. I mean, it's once a year for an hour the Queen comes to Parliament and opens Parliament. I think it's very important that she is seen to do that. I think it is the outward and visible sign of a very strong, vibrant constitution. It is for Parliament to seize back the power that it had, to take it back, to exert its will, and to hold the executive account, and the only people who can do that for it are members of Parliament themselves.
And already the scene is shifting, because the House of Lords, I'm just watching, there's very few people left in it now, and they're just odd people filing out, going off to lunch and everything. Well, now, sitting with us in the gallery, and I've lost I've lost what I was looking for. I'm looking for a rather useful bit of paper, but it's vanished. I was going to come to you, but I won't. I'll come to you in a moment. Let's go down in the meantime to Kidderminster and join Sian Williams, who's there, and people down there were listening attentively to what was going to be said about the National Health Service. Sian.
Yes, they were. They were very interested in what was said about the National Health Service, because, of course, there has been a huge campaign here to protect the local hospital at Kidderminster, and Dr. Taylor, who you were speaking to a little bit earlier, got in with a thumping majority because of his campaign to protect that hospital. But they were also very interested in reforms on crime. They want to hear more details on that. This is a rural area, so in fact the crime figures are a bit below average, but despite that, of course, we still have disturbances here at a weekend. On a Friday night there was one, so they want to see more. Bobby's on the beat as ever. With me is Inspector Richard James from West Mercia Police, and also we've got here Chris Norfolk from Victim Support. Inspector James, a lot of talk about reforming the police service. Do you think it needs reform?
I think we've got to move with the times. The police is the society of today, and times are changing. So with respect to reform, we've got to listen to what the public is saying and change if necessary.
In what way, do you think? I mean, there was some suggestion of having league tables, like naming and shaming police forces on crime figures and detection rates, much like sending in Ofsted, I suppose, and having league tables there with education. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, for a number of years we've lived with performance indicators, and that's the way that we measure what we do. We need to be careful that we're sensible in what we set as performance indicators, and that they actually drive us to be doing long-term solutions to some of the problems that we have locally.
Chris Norfolk, you work for Victim Support. What do you think the victims of crime want to hear from the government?
I think many people's perception out there is that we don't have enough police on the beat. But I think fear of crime is a bigger issue, really.
You wonder why, though, don't you? Because the British Crime Survey seems to be suggesting that the crime figures are actually going down, and violent crime too. So why are people still worried?
Well, if you look at a local community like we've got here in Kidderminster, it is a fairly below average crime rate. It's certainly nothing spectacular on a national scale. But people's perception is high, I think, because we tend to live in a more insular society these days. And we probably don't know who our neighbours are, who lives next door to us, and therefore we feel a little bit more vulnerable in our society.
Okay, let's talk about Inspector Richard James. Thanks.
Okay, well, we leave briefly to come back to see the departure of the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh from the palace. Says goodbye to the Lord Chancellor, goodbye to Robin Cook, goodbye to Black Rod. No, not goodbye to Black Rod. Goodbye to the captain of the Gentlemen at Arms in his military uniform that Margaret J. was talking about a moment ago. So the Queen is leaving, and it's midday, and she's not going to review the troops, which she normally does at Buckingham Palace, because she wants to get off to Ascot. And racing, very important, of course, to the Queen and many other people, and a lot of more people probably watching it than watch the state opening of Parliament. But and there was an occasion, I remember when Ted Heath became Prime Minister, when actually he couldn't become Prime Minister because the Queen was at Ascot. They had to wait for her to come back, for Harold Wilson to go and hand in his seals of office in 1970. And then later that evening, he became Prime Minister. The Irish State Coach pulls out from under the Victoria Tower to be escorted back to Buckingham Palace with the two outriders in the front, Russell Adams and Malcolm Rankin. And the flags change. Royal Standard is lowered and the Union flag hoisted at the top of the Victoria Tower. Bells ring out once more. So a brilliant day here in London as the Queen returns to Buckingham Palace at the end of this ceremony. And the Crown is now also on its way back to the Tower of London. I said it used to be kept at Hampton Court, but nowadays it's locked up in the Tower, but still escorted by the watermen. The Blues and Royals dismounted on either side of the royal staircase. And the maces behind that used to be used to bop the crowd on the head if they attacked the sovereign. They look rather too heavy to bop anybody on the head with now. Perhaps John Prescott would be able to make use of them. And then the four pages leave. And so everybody's on their way home, and Sian Williams, who we interrupted to see all that, is still at Kidderminster. Let's go back to her. Sian.
You did. The Queen takes precedence, I think, on this occasion. Let me just tell you what's been said in Kidderminster. I was talking to you about the fact that the A&E department of Kidderminster Hospital has been basically shut because all the money is going to go into a big new hospital in Worcester, more specialisms there. But a lot of anger here in Kidderminster about that, precisely why Dr. Taylor was elected to Parliament. And I talked to a former nurse a few moments ago who said that what she wants to see is people power. The hospital was closed down because the government is more interested in saving money than saving people's lives. And spoke to somebody as well whose mother, unfortunately, died while she was waiting for an operation. And what she said was that she's pleased that victims, patients, whatever you want to call them, are going to have more say in how the government runs the NHS, but they want to see more detail.
Richard Taylor was listening to most of that, or I hope he was. I talked to him briefly at the beginning. Richard Taylor, what difference do you think you'll be able to make for Kidderminster Hospital in the House of Commons?
I've already, David, had an approach from the MP for Gosport, and his idea coincides very much with my ideas of organising an all-party group of members who have hospitals under threat in their constituencies, getting together and then meeting with the Royal Colleges to try to work out some much more sensible solution for small and medium-sized hospitals that serve rural and semi-rural communities.
Did you get in to listen to the Queen's speech? Did you hear what she said?
I'm just hoping you're not going to ask me anything about what she said, because I heard two words, and as I was standing next to some ladies who gave quite a loud cheer, those two words were about more lady members and rights for ladies, and that is all I heard. But I have picked up a copy.
That's one of the disadvantages of that Tony Benn would point out of the House of Commons hearing everything last, and then you're not hearing any of it at all. But let me just tell you what it says. It says a bill will decentralise power and direct resources to National Health Service staff. Does that sound like an improvement to you? Give patients greater influence on the running of the NHS?
What you say is staff. Now, it depends what level of staff they're talking about. It's the people who really do the hard work, the basic nurses on the wards, the doctors on the wards, who need the say. And particularly, it's actually the patients who need a say, because they are the group who are pretty well completely excluded from any say about what happens.
And Dr. Taylor, are you there as a one-club player, just going to be there to talk about the National Health Service and about Kidderminster, or now that you're elected MP and will be there presumably for 4 years, do you have other things you want to do?
Right, obviously, because my experience is within medicine and the NHS, that will be my prime aim. But I have already had letters about subjects far away. I'm going to arrange during the summer recess meeting with important people and with ordinary people. The police, I caught a little bit of a snatch about that, and I've already had an invitation to meet the police. I've already talked to one of the biggest employers in the area, and during the summer recess I will be talking and listening and then trying to take on as many of the needs that I possibly can.
Dr. Taylor, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Richard Taylor, one of the new independent MP. There was only one independent MP before, Martin Bell, former BBC correspondent, but now he's picked up the handle there. Now, in the House of Lords, this departure of people still in uniform, these are the yeomen, and they go out and they get rather prosaically into coaches to be driven back to their headquarters. But this is the last we see of them in their finery. Not to be mistaken, and they get very angry if they're mistaken, for the yeoman warders at the Tower of London. They're in Tudor uniforms, and they have these 7-foot-long halberds called partisans, fearsome weapons. They were created by Henry VII also after the Battle of Bosworth Field. They're said to be the oldest military corps, or what you might call the remains of the oldest military corps, because they're now retired servicemen. They used to be responsible for the safety of the sovereign and used to sleep outside the sovereign's bedchamber and eat the sovereign's food. Well, now, watching all that as we saw, and I didn't introduce them before, but they are here with us, Paul Thompson and Julie Greenwood. We saw you in the gallery looking down on the state opening. First of all, on the ceremony itself. Julie, what did you make of it?
It's spectacular. It's like watching a piece of theatre in the Queen's style. It was amazing. A lot brighter than on the television.
A lot brighter than on television.
The gold's golder, the sparkles are sparklier. It's spectacular.
Paul, what about you?
I like it. It's a good part of history, and I think we should keep it, really.
But you like it, but you don't like the political system at the moment.
It's not the way it is at the moment. That should keep. I mean, it's part of history, and you've got to be able to see and carry on forward with it. Just to, if you can't see where you've been, you can't see where you're going. If Britain's good at one thing, it's all the pomp and pageantry, and that should definitely stay. I don't think that deter people from voting just because of one day.
And yet you like all that, and part of that is the right to vote and the freedom that's been won to vote, but you didn't choose to vote.
I think choosing not to vote is still part of the freedom of voting. If you're going to force people to vote, then it's not a free country. If you're going to force people to vote, then I think on the ballot paper you should have another tick box saying none of the above.
Would you say, Tony Benn, that he should vote, or would you think it's a complete freedom not to vote in the way he puts it?
But I think Dr. Taylor is a very interesting case, because people said, this guy will represent us. And he got a 43% swing. You see, nowadays we're all being managed. And people feel we're not being represented, we're being managed. And I thought Richard Taylor's victory was an astonishing one, because all of a sudden representation came back into the system. And I think, I don't know what his views are on other matters, but at least that's the answer to not voting. Whether you would have voted for him if you'd lived in Wyre Forest, maybe you would have done.
If there was more people like him that stood up for what they thought and not towing the party line all the time, then
well, there are quite a few actually, but that's a matter of opinion.
Julie, what about you? You did vote, and you didn't feel it was. I mean, you voted in a very safe Labour seat and didn't vote Labour, as far as I know.
I didn't vote Labour, no. I think you should vote. People died to give you a vote. It's important. I think it's still relevant. I don't know why people are so turned off. I don't think today's drama would encourage young voters to go out, but it looks good. It's good for tourism. But I think you should vote. People put a lot of effort into standing to be your MP, and you should make a decision one way or the other.
Well, I agree with Julie, and I think it's important. I once heard Tony Benn make the most marvellous speech in the House of Commons, which was an inspiration to a lot of people in the House at that time, when he said of the state opening that these are symbols of hard-won liberties over generations. They're not just meaningless. They're not just meaningless. The door is slammed in Black Rod's face to show the supremacy of Parliament over the Crown. It does matter, and I agree with you, Julie. It is a very splendid occasion. I think if more people were able to see it, and if more idea was taught in schools of citizenship and the need to take part in democracy and the need to vote and the terms and contexts in which it takes place, it would be very much better for it. And I fear for the future of Parliament if people don't see and understand, it is not explained to them what all this is about.
Because you can argue that people not voting is more to do with people just finding the economy is working all right and things are going all fine.
Nobody ever stopped me in the street and said, I'm not voting Tony, I'm so happy, I'm so content, I'm going away on polling day. Don't tell me no.
They didn't vote because the press and the BBC, not the BBC, but I mean the press, the media told them, I mean, it was not to vote, that there was going to be a very low turnout, that in some way it was all over. I found in my constituency astonishing numbers of people who did not say, I am not going to vote, but just said, I haven't yet made up my mind.
Okay, what about what we see of the House of Commons, which is mainly Prime Minister's questions, gladiatorial? I mean, the two of you, for a start, do you find that, does that turn you off?
Totally boring.
Totally boring?
The way it is at the moment. I mean, everything's handed to him there on a platter. There's no real debate. I mean, the Prime Minister's got all the questions there in front of him, and all he's throwing out is constant statistics, and he can make statistics mean anything.
Tony Benn, you answer. He says that's what they see.
Well, I mean, that's what's covered. Some of the speeches that are really good are not covered. But nowadays, you've got to remember, can I trouble the Prime Minister to remind us of his latest triumphs? And somebody said there's so many planted questions, they should call it gardener's question time. And there is a point there. But if you want to vote, wouldn't you also like to vote for Lady Jay? Why can't you vote for her? You see, I think if we're going to talk about democracy, what about a fully elected system? And I think that argument, that's what annoys me about the peers, because every one of them won their seats in the election. Why? because they didn't stand for election. So we've got to have a fully elected second chamber, and I'd like an elected head of state, and then lovely rituals to celebrate our history that have got nothing to do with...
Briefly, Margaret, and then Edward.
Well, only on the rituals. I'm sure we'll come back to the thing about House of Lords reform, but I think that what you said about, you know, it's very good theatre and it's dazzling and all of that, I would absolutely agree with you, but I have to say to Nicholas that if I was going into a school and doing a civics class or a politics class, I'd be extremely hard pushed to explain the connection between all of that and the things that people want to do as far as politics are concerned.
Absolutely right.
I wouldn't be at all. So.
Edward Jones?
Can I just make the point in relation to elected peers that if all peers are elected, we will lose the services of many very valuable people who give their expertise, their time and their energy to the life of the upper house. Those people would not stand for election and we would lose their contribution.
Okay. One last thing. We've heard these backbenchers, senior backbenchers on both sides in the House of Commons talking about power going away to the executive. And we've heard this before, of course, so they're always complaining that they don't have sufficient power and don't have sufficient debating time and all that. Do you think there's truth in that? Should it all be... is there any chance it changes?
I think there is some truth in it. I think if this was a brave government, it would actually break the control of the Whip's office over the appointment of people to select committees.
And would anybody let that happen?
No, well, I think they could let it happen. And I think that...
Tony Blair would let it happen?
Well, I hope that he might. I mean, I do think that there is a case for putting people on select committees who really know what they're talking about, for having a select committee structure which is within Parliament, becomes a path in itself of real expertise. And I think some of the select committee work that is done, as a minister, in the last government, I thought the work that the Defence Select Committee did, which was highly critical of me on several occasions, I thought was really admirable in its depth and expertise. And some of it never got the airing it deserved. And I think the breaking of the power of the Whip's office is crucial to the greater scrutiny of the executive.
Okay, well, let's just leave it there for the moment. We've got 99 newly elected MPs this Parliament, some of them not been here before, most of them not ever been here before, all of them ambitious, all of them, of course, dreaming of the day when they could be made possibly a junior minister, even rise to lead their party. Well, Zainab Badawi is with two new entries. Zainab.
Yes, David, I have two very interesting specimens with me. Viscount Thurso, the first hereditary peer to become an MP and, crucially, keep his title, and Sean Simon, a leading journalist and commentator now turned MP. Sean Simon, you were seen very much as the Labour mouthpiece in the Tory press. You're not going to have much clout now that you're a mere backbencher, are you?
No. I mean, no, in most orthodox senses, however way you look at it, I think you have more obvious and direct influence as a columnist than you do as particularly a government backbencher. But you know, it's a long game, and ultimately, I mean, politicians have actual power as a group. They actually do things and decide things and change laws and make a difference. All columnists can do at the end of the day is change the context in which politicians make decisions.
You must have felt a bit strange there, because you've been in the press gallery on numerous occasions covering the Queen's speech, but this time you're very much a participant rather than a spectator. How did it feel?
Yeah, it was funny business. Funny business. I mean, I normally watch it on the telly. I normally in an office somewhere. I think it's probably the first time that I've actually watched it in the flesh, the Queen's speech. However many dozens of times I've seen it before. I have to say, what struck me the most was how incredibly glittery the Queen was. Her crown is extraordinarily glittery, and all over her she's covered in glittering diamonds, I assume, or jewels. I don't know what it is.
I think they are real. I think we can reliably say that.
I assume they're real, yeah. Very impressive.
But did you find it very awesome?
I'm not sure if awesome is quite the word. I mean, there's a certain absurdity to it as well. But it's as you know, as splendid occasions packed with pomp and grandeur and finer go, I imagine this is, you know, up there in the top 10, certainly.
Right, Viscount Thurso, actually I don't know what to call you. John Thurso, now that you're a mere MP in the House of Commons, but you're still a Viscount, of course. But you took quite a risk, didn't you? Because you were MD of Champneys, the exclusive health farm, but a lot of people said, oh, we're not sure about a Toff-standing Caithness and Sunderland, but you got it. I mean, you must have really wanted to become an MP.
I did, very much indeed. I mean, one of the things, having had this curious experience of sitting on the red leather before coming down to the green leather, is to discover how totally impotent the upper house is You do a tremendous amount of work. You have wonderful debates. You think through wonderful amendments. You get them passed by the House, and the Commons give you a great big raspberry, and that's an end of it. And I mean, it really, I think, that's why I'm so pleased to see that it's going to be, I hope, further reformed. But I think that the real power is obviously in the elected.
And were you aware of that impotence when you were an MP, a peer in the House of Lords?
Oh yes. I mean, I'm going to give you one example. I put an amendment to the Scotland bill from the front bench. It was passed by the House, and what it did was decouple the link between the number of Scottish MPs and the number of members of the Scottish Parliament. Well, that was rejected by the Commons, and it was not pressed by their lordships. And it is now one of the major constitutional problems.
We get the picture.
Yeah.
We get the picture.
Okay.
But any surprises in the Queen's speech for you?
Well, I have to say I was very surprised to see Lord's reform come back in. I confidently predicted on radio last night that that was one thing that would not occur. I think the problem is it's going to be tinkering. I didn't like the little thing about after consultation, because we've had Wakeham and we've had all of that. There is only one answer to the upper chamber, and that is that it is fully elected, and the sooner the better.
But look, you both have given up pretty much very lucrative careers. You are both leading people in your own professions. I mean, why do it? Sean Simon, why?
Well, from my point of view as a journalist, the Sun columnist Richard Littlejohn has always had a line that in any group of people, that the normal people in a room will be happy to mill about in the middle. There'll be a strange group who naturally want to stand up at the front and tell other people what to do, and there'll be another strange group who naturally gravitate towards the back and throw bottles at the people at the front. People at the back obviously being the journalists, and the people at the front being politicians. I enjoyed throwing the bottles, but actually I think it's a better thing to do to stand at the front and take responsibility.
John Thursday?
Curiously, I really want to serve my constituency. I would not actually have stood for any other constituency. It's my home, and I really think...
And your grandpa was
yes,
there
it was
many
his
years ago,
constituency, from 22 to 45.
Oh, right, we've got the dates.
But so that's kind of fun. But it is my home, and I suppose I'm a very old-fashioned backbench MP, and that's what I want to be, which is to actually look after the constituency as much as I can.
I want to say that you might get promotion from Charles Kennedy. You never know.
No. Gosh, don't put a jinx on that.
John Thursday, Sean Simon, thank you both very much. Thanks.
Zainab, thanks very much. Well, we're joined in the studio, if I can stop my guests chattering to each other here. So you'll be able to hear by Andrew Lansley from the Conservatives, who planned the Conservative campaign that was such a success, Matthew Taylor of the Liberal Democrats, and Barbara Roche, who's the new Labour Minister in the Cabinet Office. Andrew Lansley, we had our political editor here, saying they'd done what they said they would do. They've done what was in the, broadly speaking, except for tobacco advertising, they've done what was in the manifesto. Do you agree? I mean, do you think it's fair cop, this, from the Tories' point of view?
Well, I think if we're quibbling, I think people might have said that Labour promised to do 24-hour licensing in public houses as well. But let's just look at the main features. Of course, the main feature is to do with health, education and crime. But I think when one actually looks at what was promised in the general election and what is to be delivered as a consequence of this legislation, there is an enormous gap. You can't legislate for additional capacity in the public services directly. You can't directly legislate for more doctors, for more nurses, for more teachers, for more police. What you can do is to set those services free, get rid of the bureaucracy, and remove some of the things that have been demotivating teachers and doctors and
so you would
police.
expect more bills, more acts in this Parliament?
What I'd like to see in
or is it better administration?
What I'd like to see in this legislation is literally much of the bureaucracy, controls and planning that was put in place under the last 4 years of the Labour government removed by way of this legislation. I fear we will not see much of that. That on education, for example, we'll see a government that got rid of grant-maintained schools now tried to bring a bit of freedom back to schools, but not much.
A likely story that they put in legislation in the first Parliament and withdrew it all in the second. There'd be a laughing stock.
Well,
and you'll be one of the first to laugh, wouldn't
Yes,
you,
I will be one of the first to laugh, because that's precisely what's happening. Let's have a look at education. They got rid of grant-maintained schools, now they want to delegate budgets to schools. They got rid of the assisted places scheme, now they want to bring back the private sector into schools to an extent. In health, they want to increase the role of the private sector, but yet in the last Parliament they imposed additional tax measures on employers' health insurance. They've been moving in one direction and realised that it's gone wrong. Okay. Now, the move back in the opposite direction may well be too little, and it may prove not to be the kind of bold and radical steps in setting public services free which are really required.
Well, we ought to talk to the people who are going to be who say they're going to be the real opposition, the Liberal Democrats. Matthew Taylor, what is your real opposition to this Queen's speech?
Well, firstly, there's, of course, in the nature of Queen's Speech, is precious little of the detail, and the detail that we're being told about is the move towards privatisation in health and in education. Issues that were not presented to the electorate, certainly were not the priority for people who voted Labour in the last election, I think, and that move to the use of the private sector, effectively by stealth. People voted Conservative, they knew what they were going to get, but people didn't vote Labour for it, needs, I think, strong opposition. It needs strong exposure and scrutiny in Parliament, and we know we won't get that from the Conservative Party because they actually agree with it. We also see missing from this Queen's Speech what will probably be one of the defining issues of this Parliament, and that is any legislation relating to any referendum on the euro. We think that that paving legislation should have taken place, not least to make sure that any referendum is held on a free and fair basis.
What
and so that the government
say we're going to bring in a bill so that if we do make up our minds to join the euro, this is the bill we'll have for a referendum.
We pressed in the last Parliament, and we'll press again in this one, for the legislation to be in place for the referendum, and indeed for other referendums that the government has said that they would like to see, but make no promises to deliver, such as on further constitutional reform and electoral reform.
If you think that the detail isn't there, so you can't make much of the things they're proposing anyway, do you think there's any point in the Queen's Speech?
Well, I mean, you had this discussion earlier on. It is a ceremony. It is not a practical piece of government, and there's always room for ceremony on occasion. But the practical work of government will start as these bills are brought forward and we see the detail. Okay. And we already see the government running into considerable difficulty on this issue of the creeping privatisation within health and education. There may be a role for the private sector on occasion, but let's have that debate out in the open and up front, not sneak through without the electorate ever getting any real say on it.
Okay. Well, Barbara Roach, we've been told this government, I mean, it's been spun endlessly, this government is a completely different kind of government from the last government, and Tony Blair's got rid of all the people that he didn't really need, and you're all a lot of tough thugs now who are going to make sure things happen. Well, that's what we're told. Do you think that the promises that so far what we've heard today and the criticism you've heard, is there any hope of getting some of these things done? We've already seen trade unions resisting very strongly in Brighton, measures that you'd got elected on only a week, 2 weeks ago.
Well, it's not a picture I recognise, and nobody who knows me could possibly ever, accuse me of being a thug. What I hope that we will be doing is having that real concentration on delivery of services. I mean, the experience of the last Parliament and the last Labour government was this: that we had to spend our time rebuilding the economy, getting that on a stable basis, then putting in the investment. But the real lesson I think that I took away from the general election is that people now wanted to see that translated into real delivery of public services, particularly on health, on education, and fighting crime. And that's what this Queen's Speech is actually about.
And do you feel diminished by only getting the vote of a quarter of the electorate?
Well, I do think it's a great pity that the turnout was so low. I think it's a problem for the political process as a whole, and I think we need to look back and see how we re-engage. And it's really, of course, with local elections again that we'll have a year from now.
You got the second house. You got the second house swinging against you, didn't you?
Well,
second only to Sean.
Well, I think actually my constituency is very interesting in that if you look at it, where I had a constituency which before 1992 was a solid Conservative seat. And then I had an extremely high sort of majority, something like of 20,000. And what I think happened there was that some of our votes decided we were going to win, they'd stay at home. The Tory vote collapsed in parts to the Liberal Democrats. But the main thing is, why was it that, generally speaking, people did not didn't turn out? And I think that's something that should concern us all.
Thank you very much. Let's come back to that. Betty Boothroyd has joined us. Baroness Boothroyd, I should call you now, the former Speaker. Now, we saw you earlier on taking our two guests around the House of Commons. You sat there in the chamber as Speaker for a number of years. Do you think something's gone wrong with the way that the House of Commons works, that is turning people off and leading to the effect that Barbara Roach just mentioned?
Perhaps that has to do with the media, of what they show of the House of Commons. You know, they have a responsibility too.
And what is it they don't show that you'd like to have seen?
Perhaps they show the scenes that are more robust and not the more serious debates that take place. You know, David, that has a lot to do with it. The media do like sensationalism. And there are a lot of hard-working people in the House of Commons who are there quite late at night, during the late afternoons, dealing with the nitty-gritty. And this is not always shown. It may well be a little rather boring to the public, but nevertheless it is there. Now, you ask me, could changes be made? Perhaps this is what you're suggesting. Well, I would like to see very much a government, and many governments are to blame for this, who don't use the House of Commons as I think they should do properly, in that much is done outside. Much, again, is done in the media in the mornings. I listen to radio every morning. I did when I was Speaker, rather more avidly than I do now, to listen to what was going to happen that day. Much of it was said on the radio. Now, I disapprove of that. But the House of Commons is the forum of debate for this nation, and I want it to come there, first of all.
But you can say that with all the majesty now at your command.
I said it when I was there too.
But you can't deliver it, because if it's in the interests of Tony Blair now, or whoever leads the Conservative Party, Andrew Lansdowne, tell us who it's going to be in a moment, to manipulate politics in that way, how do the people get it back? How do the House of Commons get it back?
The House of Commons itself has to do that. The House of Commons is master of its own procedures. It has a procedure committee. It has various, what is called modernisations committee. It is up to those. It is not the Speaker who is certainly can take a lead to some extent in that. It is the Speaker, and whichever Speaker it is the servant of the House.
But you're saying the House of Commons could, if it so chose.
If it so wished, it could do that.
And that means 400 odd...
Through its committees, through its procedure committees, stating its standing orders, looking at it
But you have to put a
like
bit of backbone into 450 or 460 Labour MPs, many of whom have only just arrived and long for preferment.
Well, perhaps if they've just arrived, then they're very good subjects to deal with if they've just arrived.
Well, see, we join Zainab Badawi again down in Central Lobby. Zainab.
Thank you, Dave. Well, of course, there's an awful lot of state, in the state opening of Parliament, there's an awful lot of pomp and ceremony. Now, one of the traditions is that the Vice-Chamberlain to Her Majesty's household, usually, well, it is always a government whip, you're held hostage while the Queen comes here. Now, you've done it for the last 2 years. You've been let off this time. What happens? I mean, you go to Buckingham Palace, and what then?
Basically, your head is on the block, and if the parliamentarians decide to keep the Queen, never happened yet, but if they decided to do that, then I'm afraid you'd lose the Vice-Chamberlain to Her Majesty's household pretty quickly. So I'm always very relieved when the Queen shows up again and comes back to the Buckingham Palace.
Right, and what actually happens when you're in Buckingham Palace?
Well,
where are you kept? Are you kept in a dungeon?
It's extremely onerous and tough. I'm fed smoked salmon sandwiches and dry sherry, and watch the BBC coverage from a very nice room with the ladies in waiting at Buckingham Palace.
And you have this wand of office.
Yes.
And, I don't know, tell us a bit about that.
It's called a white stave. I suppose I've been white stave, which is the counterpart to black rod. I don't know. But it breaks in two. You carry it on state occasions or when you present messages to the House of Commons. When you walk into the House of Commons, there are lots of ribald comments about put some chalk on the end, or are you going to play Hurricane Higgins, or very undignified comments made in the House.
And you get to keep it? You don't give it to your successor?
When you finish, and I finished last week, I went to Windsor and the Queen ceremonially unscrews this and hands it over. It's rather like having your epaulets ripped off after a court-martial, I imagine.
Rather attractive wood, and then this solid silver with the engraving.
It's a silver ferrule with and a willow wand. And it will take pride of place over my fireplace.
And do you exchange any words with the Queen, with Her Majesty, when she comes into Buckingham Palace and you leave?
Yes, but those are sort of confidential between the Queen and the Vice-Chamberlain. But I don't think it's any secret that Prince Philip always says, look after the old place for us while we go down to Parliament. And we've always managed to do that so far.
Thank you very much, Graham Allen. Thank you.
The House of Lords is already being dismantled because it has to be in session again at 3:30 this afternoon. The benches that the judges sat on all being taken away and the place put back, tickety-boo. Well now, Margaret Jade, one thing I didn't ask you, you gave up being leader of the House. Was it anything to do with the failure to reform?
Well, I've always been very interested in reform. There were many reasons why I gave up. I'm pleased to see that there is a reform bill mentioned in the Queen's speech. I'm slightly worried about the use of the words consultation. I hope consultation will have a time limit on it, because I think what we have to remember, for example, is that the hereditary peers will start re-electing each other in by-elections if we don't have further reform by the end of this session. I personally wanted very much to see reform go on. The reasons that I gave up are many. If I'd been absolutely convinced that reform was going to happen this session, I might have thought about it again, but then again I might not have been asked.
So you might have missed out, because if they do their consultation and put the thing through, you could be there. Your hour of glory as they go democratic. Well, if they do. Right, well, we're coming to the end, or towards the end of this coverage of the state opening. Time to tell you that if you want to come here to the House of Commons during the summer months, the building is open. This is the commercial, most of August and September. And apparently for £3.50 you get a full tour and the chance to buy some astonishing souvenirs, stamped with the insignia of the portcullis. There are all sorts of things. There are teddies from the House of Commons. They've disappeared. Somebody's stolen our teddies. The teddy's over there. Oh, yes, there's the teddy. Tony Benn spotted the teddy. There's a teddy. But there's these rather charming... this is a box of humbugs. They sell very well. House of Commons humbug. And House of Commons fudge with clotted cream. And there's some whiskey, which I intend to keep for myself, and there's some mints, which apparently are House of Lords mints and House of Commons mints. You're all invited to take one and see what you think is superior. It's a blind tasting, Betty Boothroyd. You just take one and see what you think. And Nicholas Soames,
I don't eat chocolates, but I will now.
And Julian Paul, you ought to have one, because you've been patiently sitting there.
I'm afraid they...
It's your bribe to bring you round to the...
The gold one, the House of Lords?
Yes.
Oh, I got the right one first time.
This is
nice soft centres, I think.
This is a bribe to bring you round to affection for the House of Commons.
Gets to vote next year.
Paul, do you think you'll vote next time round?
Let's wait and see.
Wait to see. Okay, eat the chocolates and see which one you prefer, Lords or Commons. Former Speaker Boothroyd, which do you prefer?
I prefer the Commons.
Tony Benn prefers his pipe.
I stick to my pipe and tea. I don't believe in all this. But I tell you one thing, one comment on the Queen's speech. The Sunday Times listed 7 companies that provide services in health and education and said that shares had soared by 50% in a few months. Privatisation means Railtrack could run the NHS and the schools, and let's not allow that to happen. I must make that political point.
Okay, well, on that political note, it brings us to the end of our morning's ceremonies. The Queen is on her way to Ascot, as is most of the BBC. We haven't discovered which mints are liked, whether it's the Commons or the Lords, but it's all from us in the Palace of Westminster. Good afternoon.
Lunchtime on BBC One Daily with Neighbours next.
A family face to face with a gang of thieves.